Hey, welcome everybody to today's session. I called it Tech Detox. That topic could attract you for a number of reasons, but I am David Litman. I'm with the Teran James Young Foundation. For those of you who are just coming in, we're just sort of checking in the chat. Want to know kind of what's in the room, how you're feeling, if there's any needs. And of course, at any point during the session, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat, but I'll take pauses where you could just come off mute and just talk too. I want to keep this as interactive as possible. I do have a short presentation actually, and I think I'm going to present some, but then I'd like this to be kind of an open discussion. For one very good reason. Again, I don't know what's coming into the room here. And this is an interesting issue I chose to talk about. It's one that we actually referenced at our summer conference this year for the Teran James Young Foundation. We had some speakers come in on this topic of technology and addiction and proper technology usage and effects of technology. And we promoted the heck out of that conference, and we got about 5 people showed up. Good news is we recorded it. So at various points in the session, I'm going to actually give you a link to that folder on our Google Drive where those recordings exist so you can learn more. Because it's a big issue. And I don't know where people are on the spectrum of knowledge and opinion on the matter of technology. So I'm going to keep, I structured this, but I structured it loosely. So this may not be like the other presentations you attended today. I haven't rehearsed a lot, you know what I mean? I prepared, but this could go in a number of different directions, and I'm open to that. I'm open to serving the needs of the group who came here today. So I will kind of do a little bit of sharing, and at various points I'll stop and encourage you to ask questions, make comments. You know, let's open this issue up. And really, I don't know how much I have some ideas of what to do, for example, but this is a very complicated issue. And I think what I want to do today is open you up to even exploring it and to exploring it further. We're not going to be able to solve this issue in 50 minutes here in a conference, right? But if I've whetted your interest and can point you to resources and get you thinking about it, I've done my job, I think, today. That's my goal today. So let me share my screen. So Tech Detox, returning to the Aina, look into the effects of technology usage. As I mentioned, this is really, I'm making some assumptions today as I come in here. I'm assuming that you agree with me that there's a problem. Now, we may have different levels of agreement around what that problem is and how pervasive it is and what we should do about it. But I'm going to kind of make that basic assumption. And here's the thing, if you don't believe that there's a problem with technology usage, and by the way, I should stress that because this is Hawaii Kaika Conference, the lens I'm looking at this through is related to children, right? But it relates to adults too, and it relates to families. It affects us all. I mean, I don't know about you, but I am on this thing all the time. I can honestly say I'm totally addicted to this device as well. And fortunately, I don't play video games, but you know, my son completely addicted to video games, and he's 24 years old. You know, and I see the effects on him. If you have any questions or want to learn more, I'm going to reference these 2 books. And Nicholas Carteris actually came to speak at the summer conference. We have a video of him going through the highlights of his book. I'm going to just hit some key points in just a minute about this. But if you want to get a deeper dive into all the research, I mean, there's so much research out there. I could bore you to tears for hours on it. And I don't want to do that, but I do want you to know where the material is in case you need to convince parents or caregivers or teachers or someone of the severity of the issue. I want you to know where the resources are. So Nicholas Carteris wrote the book Low Kids. And then Victoria Dunkley has a wonderful book called Reset Your Child's Brain, which has solutions in it, but also addresses the issue very thoroughly about what's the impact of electronic screens. She actually calls it electronic screen syndrome, yeah, and goes into the effects. And I'm going to go into that for you just briefly here. But these are 2 resources for you to follow up with for sure. If you go to Carteris's book in particular, he really focuses a lot on the idea that when you hit that screen, it's almost like if you were in the hospital and you had a little intravenous thing and you had a button, and they have buttons that you can push when you're under pain management, right? To inject more morphine if you need it, kind of a thing. Whenever we hit the phone, there's an instant hit of this neurotransmitter called dopamine, which is the pleasure chemical. It's the pleasure chemical in the brain. So it is addictive by its nature. He tells a story actually of in burn units in the military, there's burn units, and burns are the worst kind of wounds. I mean, they're extraordinarily painful, and the dressings need to be changed multiple times per day, right? And when they do that, it's an extremely painful process. And they would, inject tons of morphine into these patients, right, to try to help them bear with that process. Well, someone got the idea of letting them play a video game. And this is actually it's a virtual reality one with a headset, like the Oculus headset, right? Like a VR type video game called Snowbirds. Very innocuous game. You're like throwing snowballs at penguins or something like that. Really basic. And what they found, and what one soldier described, he said, when I was just on the morphine, I felt agony. When I was playing that game, I felt nothing. Nothing. I mean, that's how powerful a distraction and how powerful these devices and games can alter the brain chemistry. Yeah. So when you think about that, that's wonderful. I mean, it's a wonderful application. We're sparing people from pain. But think about what that does to a developing brain, right? And the younger the brain, the more impact it has. And a lot of this came out of glow kids. He calls it glow kids because when you go to like a restaurant, right, or you go to a darker environment, you see these kids in the glow of screens. I mean, I've seen iPads with bumper pads on them, so a 2-year-old could hold it and throw it down and not damage it. Do you know what I mean? And again, I'm not saying good or bad, is a hard argument to make, right? But just being aware of what the effects possibly are, I think, is what I want to start inculcating in you and in the people that you work with as well, to start having a discussion about it, to bring consciousness and awareness to what might be going on. And again, by the way, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat too here. Sorry, I forgot to open it. Let me open it up. I deleted my social media platforms. It's been one of the best decisions I've made, says Caitlin. Yeah, it's a personal decision and it's a tough challenge. I actually still do have my social media accounts. I chose to put limits. There's a screen limit option on for apps, and so it tells me your 30 minutes are up for the day. Now the problem is it gives me the option to ignore that, which I think is evil. but I don't. I can actually adhere to it. So this is a idea of responsible usage. Yeah. Okay, moving on. This is actually more out of Victoria Dunkley's book, and I just again trying to summarize some of what she talks about. If you look at the effects of screens on the body and on the mind, right? The things that it does, it basically creates a stress response, a fight, flight, heightened state of arousal. It's I'm sure you've seen studies, or maybe you haven't, but they always tell you, if you want to go to sleep, if you have insomnia, don't look at your screen at least 2 hours before you try to go to bed, because that screen, the blue light, the screen itself, the electromagnetic radiation, the energy from it, right, will disrupt your body clock. Right? It'll keep you up. My son, I've been working on him. He's 24, like I said, and he plays this game called Sea Pirate, some kind of Sea Pirate collaborative game, and he loves it, and it's great, but he'll stay up all night playing it, and doesn't realize why he's cranky the next day. So you've got this intense sensory stimulation, right? You're very engaged, you're getting these dopamine hits, right? You've got the EMF, all that is activating the body, right? And so what do we get from that? We get these symptoms, right? Mood dysregulation, depression, anxiety, it's I don't know if the impaired social interactions, we saw this coming out of COVID. We do a lot of work in the schools, and we've been talking to teachers who, as kids came back into the classrooms, one teacher was saying that these kids won't talk to me. I have kids actually, they're sitting right in front of me and they're texting me. Right. So this idea of, if you get, because they've been on screens, right? They were on screens for almost 2 years. And so, social interactions get impaired. Obviously impulse and, cognitive dysfunction, you get wired and tired, hormonal imbalances, all these things can, and again, I don't want to go too deep into this. But if you don't, again, we have to decide at some point. I'm going to pause in a moment and I'm going to let people challenge me or ask questions about this if you have it, but because I don't know how deep we want to go, right? But I think if we could just kind of agree that there is a risk here, there is some danger here, it's something we want to pay attention to, in particular because I want you to consider if you're seeing, again, this is for you or the people you work with, or people in your life, but if you hear people talking about symptoms, or you're experiencing symptoms, or you see people who are having symptoms with people you're working with, we want to look at causes. And I think this is an looked at cause. It's a potentially of what's the word I'm looking for? We bypass looking at this. We don't consider that a lot of the things we were just talking about, right? Mood dysregulation, anxiety, oppositional defiance in the children, things that you may be hearing, these complaints about these kids. Screens may be playing a role in that. In fact, they may be playing a causatory, like they may be one of the primary causes of it. And we think it's something else, right? We think it's just ADD, or we think it's, some other kind of chemical imbalance. Well, what's causing the chemical imbalance, right? So if anything, if I can just open people's minds today to this idea of, hey, let's consider this as well. What are they consuming? How much are they consuming of it? Yeah. Could that be contributing? Something to think about, I think. It's important, and it's, I think, overlooked. When I was preparing this presentation, Deb Mora, who's with the Hawaii Kaiko partnership, she asked me, she said, hey, how are you going to relate this to protective factors? I thought, that's a really good question. I hadn't really thought much about it. I was just, I had my own agenda, right? But I think it does relate to the protective factors. If you think about effects, right? Effects and the repair that can occur. I mean, if we talk about knowledge of child development, right? Understanding how brains are developing and how this might impact them is important, right? This could affect child development, and it's certainly one of the people who works for us, actually. She's got 3 kids, and her 13-year-old right now, and she are just constantly fighting over the phone, phone usage and technology usage. It's something that happens a lot. Social connections, again, how are kids connecting? Are they only connecting through social media? Are they only connecting through screens? Which feels like connection, but really, I remember way back in the days of like CompuServe and chat room. At least I'm dating myself. This is back in like the 90s, right? When these things first started coming out. I remember the study showing that I remember feeling like, oh, I'm connecting with people all over the world. It felt so good. And at the end of it, I was depressed, physiologically depressed by spending all that time on a screen. So is it impairing social connections? Do we want to improve social connections by addressing the issue? Parental resilience. Yeah, I mean, again, parents are constantly, my kids are 24 and 21, so they were really one of the first generations. Fortunately, they weren't begging for screens at 6 or 7. They didn't exist. They didn't exist until they were in their mid or preteens, early teens. But it was a huge argument between my wife and I. Do we let them have screens or not? And I did, and I kind of regret it now. I wish I waited longer. And the children's competency, their social and emotional competency. I mean, again, is this impacting that, right? So I think this directly relates to some of these protective factors that we want to foster and can impact it. Okay, before we get to what do we do, I have a big question mark there. I just kind of want to open it up because I'm about to move into maybe some possible strategies or solutions or ways to work with this, but I don't know if I've made a good enough argument. If anybody has questions at this point. Someone put, Vaughn, you put FOMO issues. Could you maybe speak a little more to that? You can either type or talk. I don't care. You can unmute yourself if it's easier. Oh, no, fear of missing out. I know what it stands for, but I mean, I'm just wondering like how you see that playing into this, if you're willing to share. I don't mean to put anybody on the spot either. I'm trying to foster interaction here. If you're not comfortable with that, you could just chat or I'll just move on. But oh, there he is.
Yeah, I think this is in relation to our young people, right? They want to be connected with their, maybe not only their networks, but just
Right.
the general. And so
Absolutely.
they just don't want to be missing out. And I think I think
Yeah.
that's why they're always wanting to be engaged in these
Yes.
these things
Yes.
at all times.
Yeah, no, I get it.
So
I think I've heard that a lot, and that's a big argument. And this is the argument I made actually to my wife back in the day, because my kids were arguing. It's like, oh, we're not able to, we're going to miss out on all this stuff. It's interesting though, Victoria Dunkley talks about FOMO in her book actually. What does she talk about? She says, again, it's appropriate to offer comfort about this, right? Because if you're going to try to restrict your kids' usage, you always want to be empathic, right, to that need that they have of connection with their peers. And I'll just read this quote from her book here. She goes, if your teen cries, hell, oh, how am I supposed to talk to anyone to know what's going on? You could respond with something like, I know it feels like you're going to be cut off from everyone, but you'll still see your friends in person and you can talk to them and, you can do activities with them. And you know what I mean? It's like, is that really the only way to connect? and again, when I read that though, I can see where, you know, that may or may not go over. You know what I mean? Like it's a tricky one. Again, that's why I'm not presenting myself as an expert here today at all, by the way. And I don't think there's easy answers to this, but I think it's something to explore, right? Which is what we're going to get into. This is a really good point. Other questions or comments at this point, and feel free to challenge me on some of this, you know, help them to come up with, oh, yeah, exactly. That's what we're going to do. Yeah. It is part of our daily, and that's the thing though, right? It's part of our daily use. The reason why I like to bring this up now is because it's only going to get worse, not better. I have a friend, a very good the dear childhood friend. I've known him for like 35 years. And he just got a job at Meta. Meta is the name of the company that owns Facebook. They changed their name to Meta, and he's a developer with them. You know, he actually builds this stuff. You know, so I've been like razzing him horribly about him working for the demon, right? Of course, we're friendly enough that I can get away with that, but you know, the idea of the metaverse that is being promoted and created is just at the early phases, right? But I mean, imagine when this becomes fully pervasive, like you're totally immersed in this world, and things are being done in this world. And again, let's not discount the powerful positive applications of it. My daughter was just saying to me just today, she's a musician, and she connected with another musician, and they're supporting each other. And she never would have met this person if it hadn't been for social media. She met her on she followed her on Instagram, and they connected and realized they had common interests, and they're supporting each other in their musical careers. You know, it's like there's definitely good things about this. It's just, how do we straight to find balance? And are we not discounting the potential danger and the potential risks involved? Yeah. Any other questions and comments before we move on? All right. Well, hopefully I did a good enough job in
I
convincing you
just
that.
wanted
Oh
to
yeah, please,
add
Shelley.
to, sorry. So, you know, like in another project that we're working on, we're
Yeah.
using social media to try to engage with families that are already on social media. Like our families, you know, that's what they're seeing is social media, right? They're not
Right.
like coming to our website necessarily, but they're on their social media feed. And, you know, it's like, we're thinking, how do we use that to get our positive parenting messaging or whatever, right,
Absolutely. Yeah.
across? Are there other avenues? You know what I mean? Because nowadays that's what our families are on. You know what I
Right.
mean?
That's
That's
the way to
just what
reach
they
people.
use. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then how do you reach them if you don't
Yeah.
engage in some kind of technology, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's kind of where we're trying to, like, how do we use it for good and not for
Yeah.
evil, right?
And I think that's an important distinction to make, is that what we're talking about is not necessarily, I mean, certainly as parents and as, you know, people, adults in children's lives, we can model, right, effective usage and behavior. But in the same way that, you know, I don't know, at holidays and certain times a year, you know, my father was an alcoholic, so I'm very sensitive about drinking, but I drink, I didn't inherit that disease, and I can drink alcohol occasionally, you know. And what I model for my kids is responsible drinking in that sense, right? I can use it responsibly, but I wouldn't necessarily give it to them. You know what I mean? So if you think of that, like where parents are on social media, sure, we're going to use social media, we're going to use these tools as designed, but we want to model sort of effective usage, limits, awareness, you know, consciousness. The tricky bit of it though is when you know, is to try to, there is and again, the younger I guess the sort of general guideline I'm trying to say is the younger the child, the less exposure they should be allowed, right? And that we want to hold off on this as long as we can. And because so many, I mean, other extreme is, you know, is parents who are stressed out and they use it as a babysitter, you know, just like we used to use TV as a baby. I was brought up with a TV on all the time in my house, you know. And that's a screen too. Again, some screens are more damaging than others to some degree, right? Because it's less interactive. It doesn't hit the way, say, a video game does. So things to consider, Shelley, for sure. But yeah, I'm not suggesting being a Luddite and totally, you know, not using this. This is going to be part of our modern world, and we have to learn how to find balance and balance with it. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Other thoughts or comments before we move on? I was always taught as a presenter to count silently to 10 when I asked that question. Allow some uncomfortable silence to say no. For a lot of people, it's you know, it's hard to speak. But again, feel free to type it in chat if that's easier for you. No problem. Okay, I'll go ahead and move on here. So lots of different strategies, but when I was looking through different sources and different suggestions, trying to simplify really what are people saying here, one of the basic premises and principles that I came up with that we can sort of keep in our mind is this idea of similar to what uh, forgive me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Uilani, said to help them come up with other solutions, right? I had this analogy that kept percolating as I was reading about all this stuff. I kept thinking, if I've got let's say I've got a cup full of oil, right? And that oil represents, it's kind of sludgy. It represents like unhealth, right? Things that are not healthy that are in my life and unhealthy activities, right? And that's what's filling my cup, essentially, what was filling my life and my time. If you think of the cup as, containing the time, right? And what I do. I thought, if I take clear fresh water and I pour that into that cup, right? There's not going to be as much room. The oil is just going to get displaced, right? Because oil's lighter than water. It will eventually, if I keep pouring into that cup, it's going to overflow, right? It's just going to be eventually filled just with clear water. There won't be any room for the oil. Yeah. So I think that's one of the principles that most of the people who I looked at who've tried to come up with solutions for this issue. That's what they're trying to advocate for, is more balance, right? Putting more nature, art, music, having those activities in a child's life, right? To just there won't be as much time to be on the device, right? So that's one approach I think that might be something we can foster that I think is useful. And I wanted to bring some culture. This whole conference has cultural elements into it, and of course I'm not Native Hawaiian. My culture is Ashkenazi Jewish, right? But I live in Hawaii, and I respect the culture here, and I really wanted to get this idea of returning to the Aina, because I think what a perfect opportunity we have here, living in this amazing place with all these cultural practitioners and all these activities and all this opportunity to connect. I mean, to traditional culture, where what's fostered here, it's ohana, it's connection to the Aina, it's connection to nature, it's connection, right? That's what we want, is more connection, more real connection, right? To each other, to the earth, and to activities. And so I think there's an opportunity here that we have that's, other places have similar opportunities, but I think in particular in Hawaii, we have a huge opportunity to help. And I think also the culture helps foster that, right? One of the things that, I work with youth here in the island and teenagers, and I was working with one teenager, and he wanted me to, he and his friends, and when they got together, I said, what do you guys want to do? And it's like they wanted to go down south to graveyards, and they wanted to bomb in the ocean. They spent hours, climbing the rocks and just jumping in, and there was not a phone to be seen. There was afterwards, they were doing things after, and they wanted me to film them, of course, right? Because they wanted to post it later. Yeah. But at least while they're doing that, they're not on their freaking phones, and they're getting something, they're touching they're getting cleansed by the ocean, so something to consider as a possible solution. Yeah. Just some other guidelines. Again, I wouldn't be, we want to be willing to set some limits around this, I think is appropriate. And again, I think the younger the child, the more the limits can be enforced, and they should be there, right? Even if they're clamoring, even if their friends are doing it, because when I argued about this with my wife, I said, well, they gotta learn how to use it responsibly. And she's like, she said, David, that's like saying, here's some crack, use it responsibly. It's like, it's so insidious, right? So how long can we hold off? Like, just questioning, and is it appropriate to take that thing and treat it like a library book where you check it out and you check it back in. There's different types of strategies that families can employ. So I really do think limits are appropriate here. And again, especially for the younger children, right? And control the access. But it's tricky. I don't know if you've ever seen one movie I'd highly recommend. I'll put this in the chat for you if you haven't already seen it. Oops, I got to go to chat to everyone instead here. So on Netflix, you probably have heard of it or seen it by now, but maybe not. The Social Dilemma. great movie on Netflix. A lot of the people who created Facebook, for example, former Facebook, executives were on there. There, by the way, they're talking about how, again, how it's like this guy who created it finds himself in the toilet on Facebook. You know what I mean? Like he gets sucked in, and he developed the darn thing, but it works so well. The way they create engagement, the whole idea is to drive engagement, and they've worked with neuroscience to figure out how do we drive engagement. Yeah. So anyway, great movie, highly recommend it. And they try to control access at one point in the movie. This mother puts it in a locked plastic container. It has like a timer lock on it, and her youngest daughter breaks the container open. That happened at BiJack. This is a shelter. We're modeling their shelter because we're opening ours here and hopefully in February. Fingers crossed. We're into construction right now, opening our teen shelter. And this is a huge issue for, do I let kids have phones in the shelter, right? And I don't think I'm going to take them away when they come in, because I don't want to deal with detox right away. You know what I mean? Like this is like cold turkey. It's like if a kid comes in, it's like, what are you going to do, right? So, but because they tried locking them up at BiJack, and the same kind of thing, they broke open. Those kids broke open the wooden box that they were stored in. So we have a safe now. I've got a locked safe that I'm going to put valuables in when they're not being used. But anyway, the idea of controlling access is important, I think. Wrong screen. What else? Victoria Dunkley's book that I referenced at the start of the presentation is all about doing a digital reset. She has a whole set of strategies for creating digital fasts. We actually, again, this is in more extreme examples, but if you come across a kid who, they're on technology too much and they're having these symptoms, they may need to do more of a harder break. And what she's noticed, and there's a lot of research to support this, when they take that break, they learn to self-regulate again. They start developing social interactions. This stuff is repairable. They actually come back to life. There is something like, there's extreme cases where, like, this one kid who was basically psychotic, that he was having psychotic breaks, and when Nicholas Carter met him, he was trying to talk and engage with the kid, and the kid just looked around. He's like, he was asking, am I still in the game? Like he couldn't, you start differentiating between reality and fantasy sometimes. So, this idea of doing the fast, and of course, then again, there's a whole book on that, right? I could spend a lot of time talking about it, but there is a whole book written on how to do that. But the basic idea is, to set it up, to let them know what's coming, to engage support, control access, again, come up with those other supportive activities, right? Our organization teaches something called nonviolent communication, and it's all based on this idea of we all have basic human needs, and a lot of our life is just we're engaging in strategies to meet our basic needs, and technology meets some needs. Well, if we're going to take that away, we don't want to leave a vacuum, right? What can we replace it with? Even in real person connections, youth and adults struggle against truth. Adding social media is another animal, but supporting the development of skills and understanding of positive interactions for positive connections, like those protective factors. Thank you, Ulani, I appreciate that. And again, if you're going to do something like this, make sure everybody's on board, right? Even the friend, because they might just go over to their friend's house, right, and start using video games. So that was an issue we had with my son, and of course, parents themselves may have different. My wife and I fought over this horribly for a year before we finally came to an agreement. We had to make sure we were on the same page, right? Because you have to be consistent if you're going to do something like this. This is so insidious, We try putting controls on the kids' phones; they just hack their way around them, So it's becoming aware and making sure you get a lot of support around this issue. Don't try to do it alone, You got to monitor there's hidden accounts, right? A lot of that's the thing. I've seen it on TV shows, It's like, did you know about so-and-so's other Facebook or other Instagram account? There's the one they show to the family and then the one they actually post on. And I found out, my daughter's 21 now, so she feels safe to tell me about things she did when she was a teenager, and that's exactly what she did, And I said, oh, I don't even want to see that account, do I? She said, no, you don't want to see that account. So, just be aware. It's kids are way better at this than we are. So you may have to get some support. Let's pause at this point after I've offered some suggestions. Does anybody else have suggestions? I'm curious, Yeah, developmental stage for sure, Lenny. Other thoughts, questions?
David, I have a question.
Yeah, please, Juan.
I'm just curious to know what are the schools doing? Are they also limiting the exposure for the kids to electronics in the curriculum? Are like they also monitoring that, or are they just it's free for all, whatever the
That's an
teacher
interesting
wants?
argument, right? And it's an interesting point, and it's actually one that Carteris makes. He's kind of a big evangelist for getting the technology out of the schools. To not, because schools are looking at technology. It does depend on the school. Thank you, Elana. Yeah, I should say that to answer your question directly. I've seen different schools having different approaches to this. I mean, and most schools, I think, don't allow, phone usage, right, during class time, at least, right? But they're also, yeah, they prevent, it can, have Wi-Fi, and they have blockages on the Wi-Fi. And I know when I was connected to the Wi-Fi at Yale school recently, I couldn't get my email, there's like blocks and restrictions and things like that. So I think it varies school to school. It becomes a discipline problem for sure.
Yeah, and I think there's one thing there's two difference between social media and using
Right.
an electronic.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Because
So I
they need it
mean,
for research potentially,
yeah,
right?
so
Yeah.
they're using an electronic,
Yeah.
whether it's social
But
media or
if
not.
they're still on a screen 6 hours
Yeah,
a day,
so it's
it's like
free.
that has impact, unfortunately, and needs to be balanced or addressed. And the interesting thing, if you go to Nicholas Carteris's book, he's got a ton in there that really kind of refutes the need for technology in schools. If you look at the effectiveness and what it does, and the argument that they'll fall behind or they won't know how to use it, it's like it's not really a solid argument. So, although to the degree that we can have influence over the schools, and convince them of that, that's it's going to be an uphill battle, I think, because there's been a lot of lobbying on behalf of technology companies, right, to get into schools, and dubious data that they use to do that. So yeah, good point though. Yeah.
Just to respond to Vaughn, I think both in the school and in the home, this is not an easy task. So for instance, in the school setting, I work in a school setting, and there is a need for technology, especially when it comes to when the pandemic hit. That was like our only way of connecting with our students at the time. And we all know that that was the same for our jobs, if we had jobs, and so in the school, it's like, I want to say 100 times worse than in the home, I want to say, because you're now dealing with several different families and children, you know what I mean? And I think the schools, I mean, there's no excuse, right, for anything negative that happens, but a lot of times some things happen before the kids come to school or after the kids leave school, but it leaks onto the school in a sense, like if something happened on social media outside of school, they came in school and now it's a problem. Whereas if they're using it for school stuff, like David said about his daughter, they're really smart, even though there's protections and there's things that they're not able to do. Some of them are smart enough to hack it and figure it out and get past like the firewalls and the protections that the school puts in place.
Yeah.
They even have like, at least most of the schools I service, they have contracts that each student and parent needs to sign when it comes to the devices that are given to them to utilize within the schools. But it's also a really powerful learning tool. So it's really hard to balance. It's really hard to balance. But I think one of the things for both, like at home and in the schools, is having that face-to-face connection as well. Like get outside of the classroom or get outside with your kids, and like do whatever the activity is with them. Not like, okay, go play outside, like, hey, you need to get out, stop being on your game. Like, okay, we'll take them out and show what that looks like, because a lot of them don't know how to play. I work with students here and I try to take them out of the classroom, do stuff outside together. And that really helps them. And they're like learning rules for games, learning rules for taking turns, and they don't know like those simple things. And depending on their family dynamic, it really changes. But yeah, sorry.
No, that's a great point. I really appreciate that. One of the things I started doing recently is I'm starting to run calling it games for life skills groups, because you're right. I mean, some people, they might need support in figuring out what to do when they're, or, they might need support in finding those other activities. So I'm a big nerd from the 80s, so I played Dungeons and Dragons, and so I took a course on how to use it therapeutically to build social skills. I'm also a therapist, and so I'm doing therapeutic role-playing games with kids, which is great because when you play Dungeons and Dragons, it's all theater of the mind, right? It's all about imagination and social interaction because you're working together with the other players as a team to accomplish tasks. So it's a wonderful opportunity to build social skills, build imagination, get them off the screens by giving them something else, right? So yeah, so we might need to lead that effort for sure. But again, I agree. Again, these things are a part of our life. They're not going away anytime soon. I think really, if we look at this, if we say this is an addiction issue, right, to some degree, that's another whole other lens on it, right? Because these things are addictive by nature. And just like some people are more or less susceptible or prone to addiction, we can look at what are the causes of that. But I think if we're going to look at it as addiction, maybe like more of an Overeaters Anonymous model versus a Alcoholics Anonymous model might work better, because if you look at Overeaters Anonymous, it's like, well, you got to eat, so it's not so cut and dry. I can't just abstain from food. It's a little more nuanced, and I have to look at ways to manage. And I think the same thing with technology. It's not something we want to avoid because it is useful, it is important part of our society, and it has wonderful benefits, and it's more like, okay, well, where do we draw the lines? How do we quarantine certain behaviors or certain applications? It's a much more complicated thing to break down for sure. But again, I think to just throw our hands up and just not even deal with it is also not the answer. That's why I'm doing this session, really. And my whole goal of this is to try to plant some seeds, right, that we can water and try to create better practices and more awareness, not only for us, but for the people that we serve. So let's see. So let's see, 2:22. Yeah, I got about 20 minutes, right? Is there more though? I want everybody to have a voice here, and if again, put it in a chat. Oh, Candace, struggling with appropriate messaging to instill healthy screen time norms without using language. Exactly, negative. Yeah, true, exactly. You get this like, well, Jimmy's mom lets him, do this, right? And again, that could not just be with technology. That's a common issue for all kinds of limits that we might want to set in our household. Like what's okay for us might not be okay for them, So well, let's get into that. I think that might lead me into my next section. But before I do that, I want to make sure everybody's feeling that they got a voice here and that they can be heard. Again, feel free to type in a chat or just take yourself off mute and share if you're willing. If you have a question or a comment or a suggestion that you think the group might benefit from. I'll count to 10 again. Yeah, what we're doing for safety and learning. Thank you, Learning. Okay, well, I will move on then. So the final piece that I presented here was just really taking a bit of a detour into what our organization teaches and promotes in schools, and we've got practice groups. It's this thing called Nonviolent Communication, and it's really about really effective relationships, and resolving conflict is a big part of this. So I was going to give a little piece on that, and if you guys are interested in this, feel free. I'll make sure you have my contact info. It's out there in Schedule. I'll put it in the chat right now before I forget. I also want to put those links in there too. Actually, I'll do that towards the end, but you can connect with me more on this if you want to learn more about it. But the basic idea is to change the approach to conflict, because if we're, again, this is going to generate lots of conflict potentially if we're either between us and kids, us and families that we're working with, parents, partners, other caregivers. There's all these different viewpoints on this and different ideas and different feelings. And if I want something and someone else wants something else, we have a conflict and tension arises, right? And what we've noticed with this is that people tend to move into an enemy image kind of a situation here, right? Conflict tends to be about winning and losing as opposed to win-win. So the idea of NVC is to try to move into partnership with people around conflict. And there's lots of nuances and ways to do that, right? But the idea is if we can move from being enemies and opposing each other with our strategies of what we want to do to getting underneath the strategies of what we want to do to what's really important to both of us and appreciating and having empathy. So let me move forward with this a little bit. Hold on, getting ahead of myself here. this is the phrase we always like to use. We teach kids in the schools too, and we try to teach it to teachers too and parents. Connect before you correct, right? It's like we're in our headspace a lot of the time. We're arguing. We want the other person to understand us, right? We want to get our point across. We're going to force it down their throat if we have to, you know, or use force to get them to do what we want. And it's like, that might work. Generally, if I do that with my kids, Marshall Rosenberg, the guy who created Nonviolent Communication, he said, I found I can never get my kids to I can never really force my kids to do anything. All I could do is make them wish that they hadn't opposed me. And if I did that, they'd make me wish that I hadn't done what I did. You know, it's like, it's, you get compliance, but you don't get commitment, right? And what do we really want? I mean, I'm as interested in why someone does what they do as whether or not they do it. Yeah, to some degree, especially if I'm going to maintain a relationship with them. So we connect at the heart level, we connect then at a deeper level before. So this idea of understanding, this whole idea of empathy, right? We really focus on empathy when we encounter conflicts related to this. If you know, if I'm looking at this teen and they're telling me all these things, reasons, you know, why they should have their device, and they're having all these feelings, and you know, before I try to correct them, before I try to make them understand my point of view. This is kind of going back to, if anybody knows Stephen Covey and the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he always said, seek first to understand, then seek to be understood, right? Empathy is a respectful understanding of what others are experiencing, staying with the energy that's here right now, not using any technique, just being present with the other person, trying to understand, right? Now, by the way, understanding is not agreement. I'm not saying, you know, I think people don't do this because somehow they perceive that they're going to be weak, the other person's going to think they're agreeing with them, they're going to lose. It's not about that. It's just about really merging with another person's world, stepping into their slippers, you know, just really taking the time to understand what their feelings are, what's important to them, showing that we understand that, moving with, you know, the analogy I sometimes give is martial arts. You know, I keep meaning to join the Aikido studio here in Wailuku. I've always wanted to learn Aikido. It seems like a wonderful martial art because unlike martial arts that use more direct opposition, like karate, you know, karate or taekwondo, where you're opposing force with force, in Aikido, if an energy comes at me, rather than oppose it directly, I actually move with it first, and then I redirect. Yeah, so it's way more. It's like that way, if someone this big can take down someone this big, you know, because they're using that energy that's coming at them, and they're redirecting it gently and lovingly, as opposed to opposing it. So that's kind of what we mean by empathy. And so there's that quote by Stephen Covey, you know, like you want to understand the other person, because then that's going to unlock the key to their heart, hopefully, too. If I take the time to understand somebody, they're that much more ready to hear what I have to say and to hear my point of view, right? Because I've taken the time to connect with them first. I'm leveraging a relationship that I'm building as opposed to trying to force my way in to make my point across. And once we do that, if we can establish connection, you know, like we do mediations, my organization does mediations using NVC, and what we do is we get 2 people together, and all we do is to try to get them to understand what's important to each other so that we can build connection. Once we build connection, they solve their own problems. You know, if I can connect with my kid, if I engage them in the problem solving, you know, ideally we can come up with a new plan, something that meets all of our needs, maybe not all of our wants, but all of the underlying things that are really important. If I can keep a hold of that, right? I want safety for you, you know, I want you to be healthy, you want to connect with your friends, you want to have fun. Okay, well, let's find ways to do that. You know, let's work on it together. You know, this idea of coming back together, and then you try to meet all the needs that way, right? Finding solutions by working together. That's the heart of MVC, basically. A couple of cautions. I mean, there are centers that now treat technology addiction, just like they treat other kinds of addiction. There may be a need for some formal interventions. You know, always be on the lookout for that, right? And of course, just because I say these symptoms may be masked, you want to rule out other factors too, right? So I always want to have that caveat in there, and to get the professional support as needed and it's appropriate. You know, families need family therapy sometimes, right? They need support and help. And if you're struggling with it, you know, reach out. I mean, one of the things that Hohi Kaika shows is that there's so many resources available in this community to help and support. So that's what I got. I wanted to leave a good amount of space, though, at the end as well here to, again, solicit questions. I'm going to go ahead and you can see our general contact information there on the screen. And remember, this is being recorded, but I'll just put some, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We'll just go back to looking at each other. I'll put a few things into chat here. First, our website, jy.org, and then my email at teranjy.org. And then I had some links I wanted to give you guys. I wanted to give you the link to our summer conference information, as well as, and I put this, by the way, these are also, that presentation as well as these links are in the Schedule platform. If you go to the event, these are handouts as well, but I thought I'd just put them in here in chat for ease, so you get to them either way. There we go. So you got a folder there that has a whole bunch of videos that might be useful. That we also have Trisha Prabhu in that folder. She is a youth speaker. She started out at 14 years old talking about social media responsibility and bullying on the internet. And now she's got an app that she developed called Rethink, which allows kids to think before they post. And so we have her talk on there, as well as Nicholas Carter has his whole talk, gives a lot more detailed support around the effects of screens and the addictive nature. And then the APA link there is just talking about like general guidelines for based on age. You can look that stuff up, like what's healthy, what's not, to try to get some guidelines to help support people that you work with. But yeah, I'll just keep it open. Any questions, comments? This is a complex issue. I'm sure there's a lot we could talk about too. Still, hopefully we opened a door here. But what do you guys think? Or maybe you're tired after a day of conferencing and you just want to end. We can do that. But no, I'll stick around here. Oh, hello. Yes, my dog agrees with me apparently.
I was wondering something, because I was talking with someone.
Yeah.
And just in our chat, we was just talking about one of the things that popped in my mind when the word value came up, letting them know like the cost of the technology or device that they want to utilize. And I was just thinking if that would be a valuable like approach to kind of share like what all these things, like how much it costs, and then what besides like how to take care of it physically, but then also comparing it to like taking care of like what we choose to use it or how to use it or whatever. But I don't know. Sorry, it's just like random, manao.
Interesting thought, though. Yeah, for sure.
Because I'm thinking that maybe coming from the what and why can help them to understand how to use, because that they could be they could be, I don't know, because I don't, not necessarily everybody has to be like community changers and like, use their device to be like amazing at it. Sometimes they just want to connect or talk or whatever it might be with the device. But anyways, just talking stories, but yeah, I just thought about that.
The value of technology in relationships. Yeah, there's complex thoughts. Yeah, definitely. It's complicated that way too, but you're right. It's yeah, I mean that there's equity issues there too, right? I mean, access to technology for sure, and what's fair, what's not, but in a way, maybe not having access might be a good thing. So you can use that as a reframe for people to some degree, it's like, hey, you're not, you're not really being, you're actually, potentially ahead of the game by not being sucked in by these things, Any other thoughts or comments, questions? All right. Well, if there are, feel free to follow up with me. Oh, did someone take off mute?
Oh, I was just going to say, just adding to what Ulani said. I mean, I think that, also just seeing like a lot of the families that we probably work with, there's a lot of conversation around like choices and trade-offs around limited resources. And so kind of thinking about prioritizing some of your limited, financial resources and what part of your life, just like devices, iPads, phones, and that connection that we have through those social platforms associated with it. How to put that in the priority list. And then to that point with kids, like I know my kids are like, think like internet's just like free, more or less. You can have it all the time. And, like who pays for it? They don't know, and so just, I think more education or understanding again around like the costs and who's bearing those costs is important.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's a very good point. Yeah, like teaching responsibility. Yeah, it's tricky because sometimes it's the kind of thing like knowledge is certainly helpful, right? And educating people on risks and effects is certainly helpful. But when you deal with things like addiction, it's like people know smoking's bad, but they do it anyway. You know what I mean? It's like there's so much out there, and yet it's important to know, because it does certainly impact and affect. It's a piece of the puzzle, right? We hope we put enough pieces together, the whole picture forms for people, and then they can change behavior accordingly. All right. Well, I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you so much for coming. And yeah, I look forward to staying connected to all of you. Feel free to email me, connect with us. We love to be of service. Candace, I go up to the Maui farm and train the staff there in nonviolent communication, and she's been gracious enough to let me come up there and teach them that. And we'll do that for free. I'll come into your organizations. We can also do mediations for your organizations. Happy to be of service. Ooh, what's that? Let's see. Ulani, where do you work, if I may ask?
I'm a behavioral health specialist. I work in the schools.
Oh, okay.
But for our like social emotional learning, sometimes I go into the classroom and I get to teach like lessons to the entire class. And in a few of our older elementary school students, as well as middle school age kids, we did this. Google has this cool curriculum. You can do it as parents. You don't have to like wait for them to do it in schools, but it's like games. It's actually using technology to teach a digital safety. And so it's games on reaching certain levels, and each level teaches the kid about safety, like keeping their information private,
Nice.
being safe with your password. I mean, there's a bunch of different ones, but after they finish each level, they get a certificate. Like one is called Be Smart, and they were smart with their usage online, and one is Be Kind, because it was talking about cyberbullying and bullying in general. And so anyways, I thought it was a cool thing, and I just wanted to give it to you guys, since you guys might great. Most likely work with kids or families who have technology issues, whatever it may be. And it's really fun. I love doing it with my kids. They're like, Auntie, can we do it again? I'm like, you beat all the levels. I gotta practice. I gotta practice what you learned and actually apply it. Yeah.
That's great. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I shared a book by Trisha Prabhu, who was our other speaker this summer, who wrote a book called Rethink the Internet. And it's really how to make the digital world a lot less sucky. It's a great book. It's really good. Kids can read it. It's designed, for younger audiences, and it's really great. It's all these different ways to be it's really about responsible digital citizenship, which is a whole new concept, right? How do we be responsible digital citizens in this age, and help again bring more connection instead of separation. Yeah.